My name is Adam Luke and I head up the School Attendance Policy and Strategy team at DFE. Today's webinar focuses on the new attendance and absence coding for school attendance registers. It's briefly going to cover the main changes in the rules around recording pupil absence and attendance in line with DFE's working together to improve school attendance guidance, and also the new School Attendance Pupil Registration England Regulations 2024. Rolls off the tongue. Um, Everything that we talk about today applies from the beginning of the new school year, wherever you are in the country. So until then, for the rest of the summer term, schools must continue to record their registers in the usual way, follow the existing rules, basically, rather than what's talked about today. And then from the beginning of next school year, what we talk about this afternoon applies. There's lots and lots of codes to cover this afternoon, so there isn't an opportunity for Q&A. We won't get time specifically for that. But if you do have questions as we go along, please do still put them into the chat. We develop in a set of frequently asked questions, which we'll share back with participants, and they'll help to shape that. So you will get an opportunity to get answers to those. We just won't get to them all on the call today. As always, we're recording this session. It'll be uploaded to the YouTube channel within 7 days of today, and that's along with the rest of our summer series. And anybody who is signed up for today's session will get a copy of the recording link sent to them as well. We've added a link to our into the chat to our full range of summer attendance webinars. One or two of those had been shown on the system as sold out. I've heard from a couple of people, but all the capacities have been expanded, so that shouldn't be a problem now. And if there was something you wanted to sign up for and you couldn't, then just try again and you should be able to now. Great. So in terms of the agenda this afternoon, as I mentioned, the first thing I'll do is run through the basics of keeping registers. Lots of you have many years experience of keeping registers, and that will be a refresher for you, but lots of other people are very new to the attendance world, and so I'm going to cover it in detail so that everyone's clear. It's a good refresher even if you do know it all. And then I'll cover the main changes to keeping attendance registers included in the new regulations and the statutory guidance, and then I'll walk through each of the codes in turn. Right, let's make a start. So the basics, as you'll be aware, a school's attendance register is a legal document. It must be kept accurately and it's kept in accordance with regulations. Those existing rules that are in place now, they're from the 2006 regulations, and as I say, they apply for the rest of the term. But from the beginning of the new school year, they're replaced with the School Attendance Pupil Registration Regulations 2024. We've put a link in the chat to those regulations, so please do spend some time between now and the beginning of the new school year familiarising yourselves with those regulations, and alongside that reading again chapters 7 and 8 of the statutory guidance, working together to improve school attendance, which puts a bit of explanation around each of those regulations. As always, it's ultimately for schools to decide what they record in the register in line with all of the legal duties in those regulations. They have to be accurate, and breaching or not following those regulations is a criminal offence. So it's really important that all those people who are tasked with keeping registers in school understand the rules. Every school must keep then an attendance and an admission register. The attendance register is kept by every school that where there is at least one day pupil, basically. So a school where all the pupils are boarders has to keep an admission register, but not the attendance register. All of the schools, including those with a mixture of boarders and day pupils, have to keep an attendance register too. And every pupil who's on the school admission register, or the school roll it's sometimes known as, also have to be on the attendance register. Pupils can only be removed from the attendance register when they're removed from the admission register, and those regulations cover the grounds for deletion when someone can be taken off the school roll, but we won't go into those today. There's another separate session on those coming up in the series. A question that's come up a lot recently is whether a pupil can be retrospectively deleted from the admission and attendance registers, and there's a simple answer: a pupil can't retrospectively be deleted from either of the registers. The registers have to be an accurate record at the time at which they're being taken, or at any point in time. And so if a pupil is on the admission register, then the attendance has to be recorded for every session up until the point at which they're deleted. So if, for example, a pupil is deleted next week, but they're not attending from today, you must still record their attendance and absence up until the point at which they're deleted. The register must be taken at the beginning of each morning session, so every morning, and once during every afternoon session that takes place for every one of those pupils who's on the register. So that's the same for each session, even if that pupil is not timetabled to attend, and therefore for every pupil, the most appropriate attendance or absence code from the regulations needs to be entered into the register. And as I say, the register needs to be an accurate record of where that pupil physically is at that time and the time that that register was taken. So from the beginning of the new school year, registers can only be kept open for 30 minutes after the point at which the register is taken. So in effect, the question you're asking yourselves when you are coding a register from September or the beginning of the new school year is this pupil physically present in school or another place that they've got permission, such as a trip? And if not, they're absent. Which of the absence codes is the most appropriate to describe the situation why they're not in school on that given day? I've been asked a lot recently about two things on this. Firstly, what happens if we've agreed a later start time for a pupil, for example, as part of a reasonable adjustment? So, for example, the register closes and the pupil starts school at 10 for a temporary period. Like I've explained, the pupil is absent for the 30 minutes in which the register is taken. So the most appropriate code for the reason for why they weren't there is recorded, which in this case, in the new code set, is likely to be C2. Because a leave of absence has been granted, so the pupil has a reduced timetable. The second question I've got a lot recently is, can an afternoon register be taken before the lunch break? Normally, the school day is divided into two sessions with a substantial break in the middle, which is the lunch break. Lessons that take place after the lunch break, therefore, are a different session from the ones before, and so the register is taken at a point during that afternoon session. But if schools want to take a register before the lunch break, there's nothing necessary to stop them from doing that, but you would still have to take another after the lunch break. And in terms of attendance recording and data collection, it's the last afternoon register that is taken for the day. Perfect. Let's move on. So in terms of the changes then, from the old set of regulations to the new, those changes have been developed in conjunction with schools, trusts and local authorities over the last few years. And the aim really of the changes is to modernise how registers are kept, make the regulations easier for schools to understand and apply, and make sure they reflect the modern school system that we have compared to 2006. So the main changes that come into force from the 19th of August, from the beginning of the school year, if yours is later than that, are that all schools of all types must keep both their admission and attendance registers electronically. And the point of that is to improve the accuracy of recording and make it easier for you to analyse data and see the patterns in line with Chapter 1 of the statutory guidance, but also to share your data electronically with local authorities in the department. Entries in the register must be preserved for 6 years now from the date that they're entered. So if something's entered today, well, from September, so say the 3rd of September, if something was entered, it would be kept for 6 years from that date. That's currently 3 years, but that's being extended to 6 so that you can look back over the course of a whole child's whole school career with you, and also to allow Ofsted or others to look back over the register since their last visit. And then the final bit, I suppose, is that the use of the national attendance and absence codes, which most of you use anyway, is being made mandatory from the beginning of the school year to improve consistency and accuracy in how registers are recorded across the country. And within that, for the first time, the same codes will be used for pupils in reception as well as sixth form. Thank you. Fine. So next I'll walk through each of the codes in turn, both the new ones and the old ones. They can all be found set out in Regulation 10 of the regulations. There are tables in there, 3 tables that cover all of the codes. Please familiarise yourselves with those, and full descriptions and explanations are set out in Chapter 8 of Working Together to Improve School Attendance, so read the two things alongside one another. The regulations set out also when leaves of absence can be granted for maintained schools and non-maintained special schools. Those rules don't apply in terms of leaves of absence to other types of schools, but the statutory guidance expects all schools to follow the same rules. So in effect, everybody should follow those. As we go through the codes, and I refer to the various leaves of absence, then the legal requirements on the coding are the same for all schools. The legal requirements on the leaves of absence and how they're granted apply specifically to maintained and non-maintained special schools, but all schools should follow them in line with the statutory guidance. Perfect. The first code then is a simple one, and that is a forward slash is recorded for pupils who are attending the school for the morning session, and a backslash is recorded for the afternoon session. Both of those obviously count as statistically as attending for the purposes of attendance data. As I've mentioned, a pupil must not be recorded present if they weren't in school during the period that the register is open, or if they arrive in school after that register is closed. Once a register code, and this is a general rule for all of the codes, once a register code has been entered, it shouldn't be changed unless the reason at the time was unknown, and that reason later becomes unknown, and you have to correct it. If you need to do that, then you must, most MIS systems do this for you, so don't worry, but you must record the reason for the change and the date and time it was changed. That means then if you can't go back and change it, that a question I often get asked is what happens if a pupil has to leave the session early. So for example, they were there for registration, but their parent picked them up at halfway through the session to go to a medical appointment. That means that the register stays the same as it was at the point of the register being taken. So they were present at registration, and therefore they kept as present. In cases where the reason isn't known at the time that the register is taken, code N, a holding code where the reason isn't known, can be recorded, and then when the reason does become known, the register can be amended to reflect that. Next code is code L. If the pupil arrives after the register has been taken, but within that 30 minutes while the register is still open, then code L is recorded. That still counts statistically as attending, but it helps you identify in the register where there are patterns of punctuality that you want to address. So for example, if the register was taken for the morning session at 9:05 and the pupil arrives at 9:25 because their bus was running late, but before the register closes at 9:35, then the code L will be used in that case. Next one is code V, and the regulations reflect and allow schools to record the fact that many pupils may need to be off-site for a particular purpose as part of their education in various scenarios. Code V is one of those, and it's used where the pupil is taking place in an educational visit or trip. The condition on that is that it is arranged by or on behalf of someone from the school, and it's supervised by a member of school staff. That's what makes it a Code V. So for example, a class going on a visit to a museum with their class teacher, or a small group of pupils going with a member of school staff to represent the school at a debating competition would be Code V. That counts for attendance data as attending an approved educational activity, so is an attending or present mark. Schools in making that decision are taking responsibility for the safeguarding during that session, and so in using that code, you're certifying that the pupil has actually attended that visit or trip. So if they were due to attend it and they didn't, then they should be recorded with the most appropriate absence code. Next one is code. Actually, before we jump into code P, let's just talk generally about the category of attending an approved educational activity, and that covers code P, W, and B. So code P, which we'll come on to in a second, is an approved sporting activity. Code W covers work experience, and code B covers other approved educational activities. And the new regulations set out a specific set of conditions that schools must apply when you're deciding whether you're using P, W, or B. Firstly, the pupil must have permission to attend another place that isn't a school that they registered at. So not their home school or another school that they registered at. Secondly, the school must agree that the activity is educational in nature and part of their educational entitlement at the school. And thirdly, it must be supervised by a person who the school believes to have the appropriate skills, training, experience and knowledge to ensure that that activity takes place safely and fulfills the educational purpose for which they've been sent to that place. All three of these codes count statistically as attending an approved educational activity, so attending for the purposes of statistics. On Code P specifically then, the activity must be a sporting activity. Uh, Next slide, please. Yeah, that one. The activity must be a sporting activity. Schools make the decision about whether you are approving that sporting activity. If you need to, you can seek advice from that particular sports national governing body if you need to. But in using Code P, you're agreeing to that the activity meets the conditions that I set out before, but also that additional and appropriate safeguarding measures are being put in place for that pupil for that session. It's also worth noting that the sporting activity has to take place during the session. So going back to that principle of the pupil is in this place at the point the register is taken, physically in this place, it can't be taking place just at another time on that day. It has to be during the session in question. So for example, if a pupil is attending a training session ahead of an international competition and a registered national coach with the appropriate safeguarding is in place, that could maybe meet the definition for a particular use of Code P. But for, say, a parent collects their pupil, their child, sorry, and is driving them to a place where a competition is going to take place the next day during the afternoon, in the sporting fixture and the activity that they're going for doesn't start till the next day, that wouldn't count, for example, because the activity isn't taking place during that session. If a pupil was due to take part in the activity, very similar to the one on the trip, and they don't, so for example, in that case, they were due to have that training session ahead of the national competition, the international competition, but they couldn't that day because they were ill, then the register needs to reflect the reason for absence from that particular activity. So you need to make sure there's an arrangement in place to make sure that you notify that they haven't turned up at that activity. And in that example, because they were ill, you would record in the register that the pupil was ill. Next code is code W, and as I mentioned, that covers work experience, and that is regardless of whether that is work experience arranged by the school or by the local authority. The school needs to be satisfied, as with Code P, that the appropriate safeguarding measures are in place. And as with the previous code, you need to make sure something's in place to make sure that if they don't turn up, that you're informed of that and the register reflects that fact. So, for example, if you're going for work experience in a local lawyer's office and they're not there that particular day because the child was ill, then instead of using code W, you record code I. Next one is code B, and that covers all the other types of educational activity not covered by P, V or W that a pupil might need to be out of school sight. It will usually be an unregistered alternative provision because the other types of education provision are covered, and if it's another school that they register, it's dual registration, which we'll come on to. It may also, of course, be attending a course at college or a transition day at another school where that child isn't on the school roll of that other school. But you know and are aware of these types of scenarios from the old Code B in the existing code set. As with the other codes that I've mentioned, schools have safeguarding responsibilities and need to make sure that that activity meets that in their mind. Again, the activity must take place during the session that you record in the register for. So, for example, if on Wednesday afternoon a pupil is attending each week a course at the local college, then it's code B. And on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, a pupil is attending an unregistered AP, then it is recorded as code B. What schools can't do is use B as a blanket or a blanket code. So for a pupil that say is having, as part of a temporary reduced timetable, is having 4 afternoons a week at an unregistered provision, you couldn't just be code for the whole of the week. You would have to record the reason that they weren't expected to be in the main school on the other sessions that they weren't required to be there, which, as I mentioned before, in the new code set is likely to be code C2 for a part-time timetable. The main deciding factor in coming to a decision about whether you're using code B really is that it is supervised by someone with the appropriate skills to deliver that particular type of provision. So if something doesn't meet that definition, or you're worried about the safeguarding, then don't use code B. Um, every time code B is used, the type of that activity needs to be recorded in the register. MIS systems provide a space to put that in, but you need to record there what that activity is. So in those examples that I used there, you'll be recording for that Wednesday afternoon. The pupil was attending a college placement, or on those two mornings, the Tuesday and Thursday morning in that example I mentioned, you'd be recording that they were at that particular type of AP, whatever that unregistered AP was. There've been lots of questions from people about whether remote learning can be recorded using code B and code K, which I'll come on to, which is for an educational activity put in place by the local authority. In the new code set. So code B and K split in the new code set because of this requirement for you to be taking responsibility for the safeguarding and deciding whether the child meets that definition of supervision. If the LA have put that in place, you can't be expected as a school to take that responsibility if you didn't arrange the provision. So if the LA has arranged that, it will be code B, code K, sorry, which we'll come on to in a moment. And if you as a school have arranged it, it's code B. Remote learning cannot be recorded using code B because the attendance register is a record, as I say, of who physically is in school at the time that the register is taken, and for those who aren't, the reason that the pupil is absent. So you're recording really the reason that remote learning will be needed. So if it was a partial closure because of a school, a snow day, for example, the reason that they're there is because of disruption in the partial closure of the school site. If they're receiving a remote learning package because the child is ill and as part of a reintegration package, then they're ill or they're on a reduced timetable. So the key thing really in determining the supervision for the purpose of code B is that supervision means physical supervision. So in deciding whether an activity fits the definition for code B, is it supervised by somebody physically who meets the definition set out in the regulations? And remote education in those cases won't, because they're not physically being supervised. Perfect. We'll move on to the next one, please. So as I mentioned briefly there, code K, very similar to code B. The distinction between the two codes is code B is an offsite educational activity arranged by the local authority. Code B is one arranged by the school. In doing so, a local authority should have regard to that same definition, and you should be thinking about those things when you are deciding whether code K can be used. But for example, if provision has been, an unregistered AP has been named on an EHCP plan or as part of a Section 19 medical needs provision, then school would record code K for the afternoons or the mornings or whatever that the pupil attends that activity. Exactly the same, as I say, conditions should be thought about, and LA should follow the same criteria. And as with code B, you need to record in the register what that particular type of provision was. So for example, the LA had arranged 2 afternoons where there was a home tutor being provided to the pupil. Then you would record for those afternoons next to your code K in the free text box that a home tutoring session was taking place. Just before we move on to the absence codes then, the last one in here, next slide please. The next one in here is code D. This code is specifically designed, it exists now for those of you who are familiar with the code set, but it is designed specifically to prevent double counting of attendance and absence where a pupil is registered at more than one school. So the rule of thumb is whichever school the pupil is timetabled to attend for this particular session that you record in the register for, records the attendance and absence mark for that pupil. And the other school or schools record code D. So for a pupil was expected to attend school A on Monday for the morning and afternoon sessions and attends those. It is school A that records the present marks, and they're not expected to attend school B for that day, so school B uses D for those 2 sessions. On the Tuesday, they're expected to attend school B in the morning and school A in the afternoon. School B would record whether the pupil is attending in their register in the morning, and School A would record it in the afternoon, and the school that isn't recording that would record code D. If the pupil doesn't attend, then you record the absence in the same way as you'd record the present mark for the school who they're expected to be at, but the other school obviously still records D. So you can't use D for sessions that the pupil was expected to attend and didn't attend your setting for. You record the reason for absence. Perfect. Let's move on then. So the absence codes are the next group of codes, and all of these map back in the new regulations to the statutory exemptions that are set out to the offence of irregular attendance in Section 444 of the 1996 Education Act. And so that is to ensure that you as schools, local authorities and as parents know what absences are likely to constitute an offence or not. So there's a group around authorised absences, which we'll come on to statistically. There's a group around unavoidable cause, and the pupil therefore wasn't required to be in and it wasn't a possible session for them. And then there's a final group, which are unauthorised absences, which are likely to constitute the offences. So if we move on to the first one, which is code C1, and this is a new code, a new leave of absence, and it relates specifically to pupils that have a licence from the local authority or a justice of the peace to take part in a regulated performance or employment. All schools can grant leaves of absence to undertake paid or unpaid employments where a pupil has a licence from the local authority or justice of the peace to do so. Paragraphs 317 to 320 in the Working Together guidance go into detail on this. But usually that will be because the pupil has been given a local authority licence to take part in a performance during the school day, or they're covered by a BOPA, a body of persons approval that covers the child, or the Justice of the Peace has given the pupil a licence to take part in a performance overseas. So, for example, a pupil who has a licence to be absent for 3 days in a particular week to take part in a film shoot, or pupils who are taking part in the school orchestra performance at a local arts festival that's covered by a BOPA from the local authority, would use code C1 for those sessions that they've been given permission to be out of school to attend that particular performance that is set out in the licence. This code counts statistically as an authorised absence. And the code must be used. I've been asked a couple of times if it always has to be used if a license is in place. So, for example, if there was an on-set tutor, if it was a long piece of filming, could code B be used for those sessions? But no, wherever there is a license in place, the law requires that code C1 is recorded to reflect the fact that the reason the leave of absence has been granted is because of the conditions in the license. Next code is for medical and dental appointments. So obviously a leave of absence can be granted to pupils to attend either a medical or a dental appointment in school time. We should always, of course, be encouraging people not to do that. And the Royal College of GPs is encouraging GPs and other practitioners in the primary health field not to do that. But if it is necessary in a certain case, code M is recorded. So that's M for Monday is recorded where a pupil is not in registration for that particular session because they have to be at that appointment. So, for example, the appointment was at 9:30 a.m. The register was taken at 9:05 and was open until 9:35, and the pupil came into school at 10:30. The register would have code M for that, M for Monday, for that particular session to reflect the fact that they weren't in registration because they were taking part in that appointment. If the pupil is in registration and is in school, they're present, and if they leave early for that appointment, then they're marked as present for the whole of the session, even though they left earlier. So, for example, if the afternoon register is taken at 1 o'clock and they left at 2:30 to make their appointment, then the present mark remains in place. Wherever code M is used, it is statistically counted as an authorised absence. Next one is code J1, and that is a new code that has been introduced to replace code J, the old code J in the existing code set. The meaning of it hasn't changed in terms of its legal meaning and description, but the statistical meaning of it has changed from an approved educational activity to an authorised absence, and that's to reflect the fact really that you as a school cannot be responsible for the safeguarding and whether the person conducting that interview is meets that definition that we talked about for code P, W, V and B. So like the other codes, this one is used specifically where the pupil has been given a leave of absence to attend an interview. That's either an interview for a future employment opportunity or admission to another educational institution, whether that's a college or a university interview or whatnot. The interview, like in the other codes, must take place during the session, so it can't be used, for example, if the interview is in the afternoon for the whole of that day. It is used for the session in which that particular activity takes place. The statistical meaning, as I say, of the new code is authorised absence, and that's the bit that has changed from the existing code set on code J to J1. Next one, please, is code S for study leave. That continues to be used in the same way. It can only be used in cases where a pupil is studying for a public exam, so a GCSE or A-level or whatnot. It can't be used for pupils who are preparing for mock or internal exams. And pupils, as you know, are all entitled to a full-time education. So if study leave is granted, it has to be sparingly, and if it is used, it has to be optional too. If the pupil wants to come into school and revise, then provision must be made available for them to do so. Code S, like in the existing code set, continues to count statistically as an authorised absence. The next one is code C2. This is a new one, and I mentioned it briefly earlier on. It should only ever be used in very exceptional circumstances, and those exceptional circumstances are where it's been agreed that it's in a pupil's best interest to temporarily reduce their timetable to meet their individual needs, so a part-time or reduced timetable. So, for example, where a medical condition is preventing a pupil from being in school full-time, and you've agreed that a part-time timetable is the correct approach to help that pupil access as much of their education as they possibly can, then code C2 could be used for the sessions that the pupil isn't expected to be in school. Like the other things I touched on, it can't just be a blanket code, so you can't use that for every session. It is for the sessions that the pupil isn't timetabled to be in school. So if they're not expected to be in on a Monday morning, you use C2, but they were expected to be in on the Monday afternoon and they didn't turn up because they were too ill on that day, it's code I for illness rather than code C2 for the afternoon session. A part-time timetable, the statutory guidance is very clear on the parameters around a part-time timetable, but it should never ever be used to manage a pupil's behaviour. And where there is a need to reduce a timetable, the statutory guidance is clear that it has to be agreed with the parent that the pupil normally lives with and fulfil all of the conditions set out in paragraph 64 to 69 of the statutory guidance. Flexi schooling and pupils who are receiving education otherwise and as a school as part of a formal plan wouldn't be using code C2 for the sessions that they're not expected to be in school because they haven't got a reduced timetable. They're receiving a full-time education, just part of it is at school. So the sessions that they're expected to be in school, so say it was every morning of the week as part of a flexi schooling arrangement, you would record the attendance or absence for those sessions, and the afternoon sessions where the parent is electively home educating, you would record code C for leave of absence granted in exceptional circumstances, because you've agreed to that flexi schooling arrangement and you're granting leave of absence to be absent on the afternoon sessions. This new code, as with the other C codes, counts as an authorised absence. Next code then is C itself, so that is carried over from the old code set to the new code set. It is used where another leave of absence needs to be granted that isn't C1 for the licence being in place or isn't C2 for an agreed reduced timetable. It is another leave of absence that you've needed to grant. As I mentioned before, all schools can grant leave of absence at their discretion. For schools maintained by their local authority and non-maintained special schools, so all special schools, that must only be in exceptional circumstances. But whilst that regulation doesn't apply to other types of school, it's expected in the statutory guidance, it's a statutory expectation that all schools follow it anyway, so that we've got consistency and fairness for parents across school types. I've been asked a lot recently about why Code H has been taken out, so the old code for an authorised holiday, and that's been removed from the code set, the new code set, really to reflect the fact that holidays will never really meet the exceptional circumstances judgment, only in very, very exceptional cases. And the new statutory guidance makes that clear, that a holiday or indeed a wider period of leave for the purposes of recreation and leisure is unlikely to be an exceptional circumstance. So if in an individual case you did grant a leave of absence that covered part of it was a holiday or a period of recreation or leisure, you could still record it under Code C, but there isn't a specific code for that in the new code set. Code C, as I've said, like the other C codes and indeed the other leaves of absence, is statistically counted as an authorised absence. Next code is T code then. So T code is used where a parent is travelling for occupational purposes in the new code set. I'd say in the existing or old code set, this is one of the most misunderstood and misused codes, not always intentionally, but just because there's a lack of understanding around it. And therefore, one of the areas where there's least consistency and fairness across schools and across local authorities. So it can only be used in a very specific set of circumstances that is set out in the guidance and the regulations. It isn't used for every absence from someone for a travelling background, for example. The regulations include the concept or the idea of a mobile child. So that's a child of compulsory school age that has no fixed abode and whose parents are engaged in a trade or business. That means that the family has to move from place to place. T code is designed for those pupils, so pupils who meet that definition, for sessions where they have to be absent from their main school because they're travelling with their family as part of that and they don't have a fixed abode. So for example, an occupational barge dwelling family where their boat is their home, they have no permanent address, and they are missing school on Tuesday and Wednesday of this week because their family need to travel for their occupation and they're not able to get to school, then Code T is used for those sessions. It can't be used for pupils who have a permanent home and a permanent address. So for example, if a parent made the case to you that they needed to fly to Spain to take part in a meeting as a one-off occasion, you wouldn't use T code. You would consider a leave of absence in the usual way. Code T is specifically for those mobile children with no fixed abode. To help to ensure continuity of education for those pupils, for mobile children, when their parent is travelling for occupational purposes in other parts of England, it's expected that the pupil should attend school where they are and where they're travelling and be dual registered at that school as well as their main school and stay on roll at their main school while they're travelling. So, for example, showman traveller families where they spend the summer moving from town to town and they've got a prescribed route, can register temporarily at schools in that area so that they can stay on their main school role and be a mobile pupil in the areas that they're visiting. And this code really represents a specific defence against prosecution that exists in these cases. So where a pupil, a mobile child, is aged over 6, and has attended their home school or their main school for at least 200 sessions in the last 12 months from the date that you're considering the absence, then it isn't an offence and it isn't deemed an offence. But that does mean, whilst this T code is an authorised absence, if a mobile child's attendance was to fall below that level, so if they haven't had 200 sessions in their main school in the last 12 months, then it may be necessary to take forward legal action and an offence may be committed. So that's code T. Next is code R for religious observance. And again, this is a long-standing part of the code set. It's used where the pupil is absent on a day that is set aside for religious observance by the religious body that the parent belongs to. And it's important, that last bit, to remember that it's the parent and not the pupil, if perhaps the religion differs. Usually, a day set exclusively apart for religious observance means a day where the pupil's parent will be expected not to go to work because they need to take part in religious observance that day. There's no prescribed list of such days, but if a school is in doubt, then they should check with the particular religious body in question, whether that's local faith leaders or their national leaders. If a religious body sets apart a single day for religious observance and the parent applies for more than one day's absence, then the school may only record one day using this code, but you could consider granting additional time either side of that day with if it meets the exceptional circumstances test and using code C. Code R is statistically classified as an authorised absence, and that's because the pupils missed a day of education compared to their peers. But if schools are worried about the particular impact on their pupils' attendance or attainment of particular religious observance days, then they should consider approaches such as changing term dates and setting them around common religious observance days if your school has the freedom to do that, working with local faith groups on how to time things, or taking inset days to coincide with those religious festivals to try and reduce that impact. Next one is code I for illness. That remains in the code set. It sounds obvious, but I do get asked it sometimes, and so for absolute clarity, it covers both physical and mental illness, where the pupil isn't able to attend for either of those. It is counted statistically as an authorised absence. I'm often asked about it and when schools should request medical evidence to support use of the I code. As a general principle, across all of the codes, so it's worth pausing on this really, the choice of register code is ultimately for the school to decide. But you, as I said at the beginning, have a legal responsibility to make sure you're recording it accurately. So in any code, you need to be satisfied that you are choosing the correct code, and therefore you may need medical evidence or you may need evidence to support your choice of coding. In the majority of cases, including on code I, for illness, you'll be able to do that by talking to the parent, and that will be the evidence, and you won't need to collect any formal evidence. So there's no expectation that you routinely have to collect medical evidence, but in cases where you feel that that is necessary to make that decision and accurately record the register, then you are able to request that medical absence. So that's usually in cases where there's general reasonable doubt about the authenticity of the illness, or you need to be certain. You shouldn't be rigid though, really, in how you ask for that evidence and in what form of evidence. Think about it yourselves in terms of what evidence you would have if you were ill. Sometimes schools ask for really particular types of evidence and parents wouldn't have that. So the best thing in that case is always to have a conversation with them, find out what evidence they have, what evidence they might be able to get if you really need that. But do be a bit flexible in that, in how you can, in what you ask for. Next is code E for exclusion. That hasn't changed and is self-explanatory. It's used where the pupil is suspended for that session, or they've been permanently excluded and no alternative provisions yet in place for them. So, for example, a pupil's been permanently excluded and the day 6 provision hasn't yet been put in place because it's day 2, then the pupil is recorded as code E. Next is Xcode, and it is worth just pausing here on Xcode because the meaning of this code got confused a bit during the pandemic when it had to be extended. In the new code set, the definition of Code X has returned to its pre-pandemic purpose and meaning. So it's only used to denote a session that a pupil of non-compulsory school age, so nursery pupils, reception pupils, sixth form pupils, is not required or timetable to attend that particular given session. So, for example, if a pupil has started reception doing 5 mornings a week and is not expected to attend the afternoon sessions, then Code X is used for the afternoon sessions. It can't be used, as I've said, for other codes for all absences of non-compulsory school age pupils. So in that particular example, if they're expected to be in school on the mornings and they're absent on the Thursday morning because of a medical appointment, then you record code M for medical medical appointment, and you make sure the register reflects that. Statistically, the X code doesn't count either as an attendance or an absent. That is because it is not a possible session statistically for that individual pupil. Next one is code Q. This is a new code, but it relates to a long-standing statutory defence that parents have, that they haven't committed an offence if the local authority has a duty to provide the pupil with transport to school and that hasn't been provided. So Code Q relates specifically to transport. It doesn't cover wider access arrangements. I've had lots of questions about that. It is only used for a session where the local authority had a legal duty to provide the transport and they haven't yet put that in place. So, for example, if the pupil goes on to roll of their nearest special school on Monday and it was agreed with the parents that they would start on Monday, but the transport to get them there isn't put in place till Wednesday, then Code Q is recorded for the Monday and Tuesday sessions. Next one is, and the next few codes, in fact, but we'll start with Y1. The next code is a breakdown of the old Y code, and that is to split out the different types of unavoidable cause where a pupil is prevented from being in school. All of these Y codes count not statistically, sorry, as not a possible session. So again, neither an absence or an attendance. Code Y1 has confused people because it sounds quite similar to code Q in that it's about transport, but code Q is used where the LA has the same duty to provide transport to the school for that pupil. It has been put in place, but it hasn't been provided for a particular session. So going back to that previous example, the transport to get the pupil to their nearest special school was put in place on Wednesday, wasn't it, after they started school on the Monday, but the bus breaks down on the Friday morning and the pupil isn't collected from their home. Then code Y1 would be used for the Friday sessions rather than Q because the transport has been put in place, but it wasn't provided for that particular session. Next is Y2. That should be familiar in the sense that it was one of the original meanings of Y code in the existing code set. It's used where a pupil is prevented from being in school because of travel disruption, regardless of whether that's local, national, or international. So, for example, the roads to and from school are closed because of heavy snowfall, or the international airspace is closed because of a natural disaster, and the pupil's stuck in another country. That's Y2. Next one's Y3. That relates to partial closure of the school site. So cases where the school remains open for some of the pupils, but a particular classroom or classrooms are part of the school are out of action, and therefore some pupils aren't able to be accommodated safely in school on that day. So for example, the school has several buildings and the block where year 5 and 6 have their classrooms is not able to be used because of a burst pipe, and those pupils couldn't come into school. They're recorded as code Y3. Next is code Y4, and that is used for the scenario where the whole school is closed. It was expected to be open on a day. We'll come on to a planned closure, but this is an unplanned closure, so it's closed unexpectedly for all pupils. The register doesn't need to be taken where a session doesn't take place, but you should still record and still need to record code Y4 to show the fact that the school was due to be in session, but it was closed unexpectedly and now they're not. So for example, that snow or burst pipe that I mentioned, if it is closed the whole building, then you use Y4. Y5 is where a pupil is in criminal justice detention and obviously therefore can't be in school. There are a couple of types of scenario that are covered here. So where the pupil's in police detention, so for example, they were arrested and they're in custody. Secondly, that they've been remanded to youth detention ahead of trial or sentencing. Or thirdly, that they've been sentenced and that sentence of detention is taking place inside a young offenders institute or something and they can't therefore be in school. So for example, a pupil was arrested on Monday evening and is in police custody during the Tuesday morning session, it will be called Y5. Or if the pupil is serving a 6-week sentence of detention in a young offenders institution, it's called Y5. If the pupil is remanded to local authority accommodation as part of their sentence, then they should still attend school as normal where possible. If it isn't possible for a given reason, for a particular reason because they're ill or whatever, a normal reason, then you use the normal code. And you don't need to worry about that. It's just the normal code for the session. This code doesn't cover the scenario where the pupil is serving a non-detained community-based part of a sentence, or community service or something like that. Say a youth rehabilitation order requires community service on a particular day. If that is a school day, let's hope it isn't, and we should always be arguing that it isn't. But if it was for any reason, then that would be called Y7 for another unavoidable cause because Y5 can't be used. Next is Y6. Hopefully we never need to use this, but it's been added to the code set to cover the scenario where attendance for some pupils is restricted because of to prevent the transmission of infection or disease, and it can only be used where the pupil's attendance to school will be contrary to public health advice or legislation, in line with paragraph 386 of the guidance and the specific bits set out in regulation 10. Finally, on the Y codes, then code Y7 um, should be used very, very rarely. It's really difficult to think of an example of where a school could legitimately use this, so please treat it with caution. It is there in the code set because we obviously can't define every possible unavoidable cause, because by the unavoidable, and that's why it's in the code set. But it's used in an emergency situation where the pupil themselves is prevented from attending school that isn't covered by one of the other Y codes, and that unavoidable cause must be something that affects the pupil and not the parent. There's very clear case law on that. So the fact that the parent has done all they can to ensure the child was at school on that day doesn't mean it was an unavoidable cause. There has to be something preventing the child from being at school that day. As I say, it's really difficult to come up with examples, and I think you'll never really use this code, but it is there if it needs to be used. The one that I've just mentioned on a community order or a youth rehabilitation order that required the child to be a community service or something is one. Another one that I had pointed out to me recently was that the child was in immigration detention and therefore isn't able to be in school that day because they detained in an immigration removal centre. Then that possibly might meet Y7 too, but it's very difficult to think what another scenario would be. As the code is so broad, like code B and K, schools legally have to record what that unavoidable cause is in the register next to the entry in the MIS system, or however you keep your register next to the entry, keeping a note, and all of those notes need to be available on request by a local authority officer, somebody representing the Secretary of State, or an Officer Inspector. And in those examples I gave, you would record in there that the pupil was in immigration detention or taking part in a community service activity in those two examples I gave. Next, now on to the unauthorised codes. These are the ones that are likely to constitute an offence. They haven't changed significantly from the existing code set. The first is taking a pupil on holiday when the leave of absence hasn't been granted, code G. And it can cover both the scenario where leave was requested by the parent and the school turned it down, but the family go anyway, and it can cover the scenario where a holiday is taken, but leave of absence wasn't requested at all, so it was just taken without permission. It's worth pointing out that leave of absence can't be granted retrospectively, so if the parent didn't apply in advance but comes back from the trip and gives the reason, and you're considering whether that actually maybe that was an exceptional circumstance, you can't grant a leave of absence at that point, so it's still G code because they had a responsibility to request that beforehand. As I touched on briefly before, I know some families dispute that their trip actually is a holiday. So if they're going to visit family or whatever, they sometimes say, well, that isn't a holiday to us. It's important for this reason. The new version of the guidance is really clear that a holiday is any absence that has a primary purpose of recreation and leisure. So that could cover a clear-cut holiday in Spain or Skegness or wherever, but it could also cover days missed either side of a long weekend to visit family, for example. Code G and all of these unauthorised codes are obviously statistically counted as unauthorised absence. The next one is code N, and I touched on this briefly as well, but this is a sort of holding code where the reason for absence isn't known at the time the register is taken. Obviously, the pupil is expected to be in school, they don't arrive, and the parent hasn't let you know what the reason was. You as a school are responsible for following up that unexplained or unexpected absence. That's a standard bit of procedure, isn't it? That will help to identify the reason, and once you've identified the reason, you can correct the N code to the correct code to reflect that. Every effort should be made to establish what that reason was, but sometimes I know it's just not possible, and therefore if that is the case, then the N code should be changed to the O code for another unauthorised reason. Where absence is recorded with N code in the register, it must be changed by the school within 5 school days of the session in question. So if you haven't ascertained the reason before that, then it changes to O code on the 5th school day after the absence. So, for example, the pupil was ill, but the parent didn't inform the school. You record code in at the time of completing the register. You go through your first aid calling procedure, and you found out the reason was illness. You believed the reason. You change that to code I. Conversely, for child 2, it's absent in the same session, no reasons being given. You contact the family who don't give you a reason, or they give you a reason that you don't believe for good reason, and then you change that from N to O. Onto Corridor then, the next one, which is pretty simple, that has remained the same from the existing code set. It's used where no reason for absence is established or the school isn't satisfied with the reason that is being given, and it doesn't meet any of the other codes in your opinion. The final one in terms of unauthorised absence is code U, and again that remains the same as the previous code set, the existing code set, and that is to cover a situation where the pupil arrives after the register is closed but before the end of the session. So they're late after registration is closed, so from the beginning of the new school year, when that is standard 30 minutes across schools, they're more than 30 minutes after the register was first taken, so it was taken at 9 o'clock. The register closed at 9:30. They arrive at 10 because they'd overslept. Then it's recorded with code U, and you would change your N code to code U. The last two codes then are administrative codes. They're not set out in the regulations, but they do allow you to keep your electronic register accurately and mean you don't have gaps and blocks in your system. They don't have any statistical meaning because they're not collected either through the daily data collection or the school census. The first one is code Z, so where a pupil has been added to the register ahead of their agreed start date for administrative purposes, but they haven't officially become a pupil yet. So, for example, the parent has agreed with the school that the child will start on Monday, but they're added to the register on Friday so that it's ready for the form tutor on Monday morning. They recorded as code Z for the 2 Friday sessions because they're not yet a pupil, but you're on the register administratively. Or where all pupils are transitioning from year 6 to year 7, and at the beginning of the academic year they're added before the summer holidays, so things are ready for school staff in September. Code Z is used for those last days before the holidays, where they're not an official pupil at the school. From the expected first day of attendance, so from the day that you've agreed with the parent that they will attend, the register must be completed. So, you must enter one of the codes that's prescribed in regulations. Code Z can't be used. So if a child was added to the register and was due to start on Monday, but they didn't join and turn up at school until Wednesday because they were ill, you couldn't use code Z for the Monday and Tuesday sessions. You would have to use the correct code, which in that example obviously is code I for illness. Similarly, if a pupil was due to start school in September and it had been agreed with the parent that they would start in September, they were added to the register before the holidays and Z coded, you can't record Z code from the beginning of the term when they were meant to be in school. You must record the right code, the right reason for absence, and follow up on the reason for absence in the usual way. The final code then, and I touched on this earlier, is where a session is where the school isn't in session and it was never planned to be in session on that day. So, for example, a bank holiday or an inset day, code hash is used to record in the system that a session didn't take place. That's different, as I said before, to when a session was due to take place but it was cancelled last minute, like in a snow event. That's called Y4. So planned is hash, unplanned is Y4. And that brings us to the end. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Lots of information there to take in. Everybody will get the recording and it'll be on the YouTube channel. So if you need to go back and listen to a particular code or area, then please do. We'll analyse everybody's questions and we'll think about how best we do some FAQs on them so that we get the right answers to people. And I think the big takeaway really from this afternoon is the way of thinking in meeting your legal obligations is that for every pupil, for every session, the most appropriate code from those tables in Regulation 10 must be recorded, and it's about recording the most accurate of those reasons, not about what is the most advantageous in terms of the pupil's attendance record or the school's attendance record. The legal responsibility is the accurate and correct reason, and the point of the new code set is that everybody is following those to improve consistency. So your school won't be looked on unfavourably for having the correct absence codes, but it is really important we get those in there. Have a lovely evening, everyone, and thank you very much. You're welcome to join us again for the next webinar, which will take place on the 4th of June at 3:30, and that covers an overview of the new penalty notice national framework. But I'll see some of you then, and then for those of you who I don't, thank you again for all you're doing, and have a lovely evening.